The Fake History of Chicago, written November 9, 2021, by Frederick Dotson, narrated in 2024 by Frederick Dotson. How fake is the history you learn in school and on TV? Is it a little fake because of human error? Or is it partially fake because history is written by the victors of war? Or is it completely fake because planet Earth is not all that it seems? The more I learn, the more I think it's completely fake, from A to Z, fabricated reality. This idea seems scary to a lot of people, the implications. But it's not scary to me. It's liberating. Instead of having drawn and settled conclusions about everything, I can rediscover the whole world with new eyes. If you look at history through the lens of fake, it's staggering what you discover. Today I randomly chose Chicago to prove this point. The fact that I can randomly choose any place on the map to prove fake history shows just how lazy the fabricators of history are. The miraculous appearance of a mega city. The common narrative around Chicago is that in the 1820s it was nothing but a couple of houses and a farm at best. I have a clear memory of my childhood schooling, where I was shown a picture like this. I grew up not far from Chicago, so our curriculum included some quote-unquote Chicago history. How quaint. Easily impressionable as a child, I had no reason to doubt this. I liked the picture and stared at it for a while. The teacher would give me good grades if I learned this stuff, and so I locked this content into my mind. It became a foregone conclusion. I was happy that I had quote-unquote learned something, not realizing that my mind had just closed to other possibilities. And this image is listed on historical websites for Chicago in the 1830s. That's roughly the same scenario as 1820. Not much change in 10 years. According to this Wikipedia map, the population of Chicago in 1830 was close to zero. One could say that Chicago didn't exist as a place. A couple of houses in the fields aren't even a proper village. Then in 1853, only 20 years later, Chicago was a sprawling city with massive cathedrals, factories, bank buildings, courthouses, and high rises. And in 1857, just 5 years more, we have a megapolis that can compete with New York City, London, or Rome. Wow, that's impressive. Imagine a small group of wooden carriage riding cowboys and pilgrims building this vast city within a very short time. What a colossal triumph! This is a photo of a Chicago courthouse in 1855, just to get an idea of the size of some of these buildings. This photo is of another Chicago courthouse. It is said to be from 1853. And here's another Chicago courthouse from the 1800s. How many courthouses do these folks need? An early 1850s view on Princess Street. You get a sense of just how great a feat it was to build an entire city like this in just the 10 years of the 1840s. For a people who could barely build wooden shacks, a truly miraculous undertaking. You know, the newly built One World Trade Center in New York City took 50,000 people 12 years to build. And that's just one structure. And yet, history books are selling the idea that an entire city of advanced grand architecture was built in maximum 15 years by a scattering of Americans who were known for building nothing more than their little house on the prairie. Don't get me wrong, it's not impossible to build a city in 15 years. I'm sure it's happened. But when it happens, we have proposals, designs, construction photos, documentation, and reports of such a vast, vast project. We learn from where the materials were quarried. We'll find stories of hardship and heroism during the gargantuan rise of a city which was to become one of the largest in the world. As far as I can tell, such documentation is absent. In fact, there's a huge gap in 1840s information on Chicago, and there's zero photographic evidence. Searching the internet and searching, I only found one panoramic drawing of Chicago, alleged to be from 1845. A bit sparse for the most important decade in Chicago history. The Library of Congress runs a newspaper archive where you can find all kinds of U.S. newspapers dating back hundreds of years. You can find the archive at Chronicling America. So I input Chicago to look for newspaper articles from the 1840s. And as you can see in my article, I did find articles on Chicago from the 1830s and 1850s, but I found none for the 1840s. This is a time we ought to find the most articles because it's the time Chicago was allegedly built. So I used search engines to input Chicago 1840, Chicago 1841, all the way up to 1849 to find something, anything, but I came up empty. A decade erased from history. Where's the evidence that Chicago was a hustling and bustling town full of construction work and hundreds of thousands of workers migrating there from afar in the 1840s? Surely it would be shown or mentioned somewhere. Or maybe it was destroyed in the Great Fire of Chicago in 1871? But no, we have documentation of the 1860s, the 1850s, the 1830s, and the 1820s. It's the 1840s, the time Chicago was allegedly built, that are missing. Fire is not that selective. But then, after a whole hour of search, a small breakthrough. Evidence that Chicago was already a big city as early as 1834. The source of this image is the website Encyclopedia of Chicago History. And the title of this image is Woodcut of Chicago in 1834. Are you confused by now? So am I. The official narrative says that in the 1830s, Chicago was just a small farm and a few tents. One of these two ideas of Chicago in the 1830s must be made up. The description below the photo says, quote, "The depiction is more predictive than historically accurate, since in 1834 Chicago was neither this bustling nor as fully and densely populated," end quote. Well, it's easy to claim that old drawings, photos, or maps are false because they don't fit the narrative. But I have an alternative explanation. Chicago would most likely look this way in the 1830s if it was already a big city in the 1850s. I'd say the woodcut shows the reality and that the images I was shown in school with the farm and a tent beside a lake are a fabrication. Here's a photo of the apparent first courthouse in Chicago, said to have been built in 1835. So what is this? This photo is said to have been shot in early 1840 or the early 1840s. It is the only 1840s photo I found in a 40-minute search. Now, this is not what Chicago was supposed to look like in 1835. It's supposed to have been mostly empty land and some Native Americans peacefully fishing from the river. How did this monolithic tower of pillars appear? And if there was no population there at the time, as claimed on Wikipedia, then who built it? This photo is anomalous. It's one of those "we forgot to remove this piece of evidence" items. It's hard to fathom how such a structure was built by the people who, so we are told, built only wood cabins. Historians need to make up their mind. Either they were capable of building more than wood cabins, or there was another civilization there before them. From where did they extract and transport the stone? Who was the architect? How did the construction workers deal with attacks from the natives? Why was this style of building chosen, considering that the American pilgrims were Protestant Christians who abhorred anything that reminded them of the old Europe and Rome? Was there public outcry when it was constructed? I found exactly 0 answers to any of these questions. The image, by the way, is taken from the official website courthousehistory.com. How unlikely is it that I didn't find a single aerial or panoramic photograph of Chicago from the 1820s, 30s, or 40s? There are photographs of other American places from this time, many much less famous than Chicago. All I found was contradictory drawings as imagined by different people. Here's one that claims to be Chicago in the 1830s. That's the way I'd expect it to look if it was a big city in 1850. Hollywood movies generally show the time period like this. The photograph is claimed to be of Chicago from 1837, but I don't believe it, because I've never come across a genuine 1830s photo of such high resolution and quality. Looks more like a movie set. That's what a genuine photo of yesteryear looks like. Here's quoting from a historical website, quote, "In 1833, Chicago was a wilderness outpost of just 350 residents clumped around a small military fort on soggy land where the Chicago River trickled into Lake Michigan. The site was known to local natives as Chicago, or the Wild Garlic Place. By the end of the century, this desolate swamp had been transformed into a modern metropolis of 1.7 million. End quote. So, in 1833, Chicago was supposed to have been a desolate wilderness outpost. And then 2 years later, it had what looks like a cathedral and a pillared courthouse. Wow, those settlers really stepped up their game. I've never seen that in one of the numerous Western movies I saw as a child. Everything I thought I quote unquote knew about the 1800s, I knew from Hollywood productions. But none of these Western movies show these gigantic structures and cities. They show outlaws riding through empty lands, fighting the natives. Again, if these were simple settlers and cowboys, would they really build these types of buildings? Or perhaps there's more to the Native Americans than we're told. A final knockdown of the official story is provided by this 1830 map by mapmaker James Thompson. The street and building layout is not much different than it is today. The map proves that Chicago was already well established in the 1830s, with streets, blocks, neighborhoods. It was not a farm beside a river. This is a newspaper clipping from 1832 about a petition for divorce to be held in the circuit court. So how did Chicago have an established courthouse with ongoing proceedings when, according to historians, 1832 saw nothing but tents and wooden shacks? Imagine building a courthouse for a hamlet with a population of 10 people. Ancient Chicago. Let's now venture even further back. Here's a clipping from 1794. And it mentions troop and army movements to Chicago, referencing Chicago as an actual place to go. And then here's another one from 1804 along similar lines, referencing Detroit, Niagara Falls, and Chicago as well-established places. So for a city that only started in the 1840s, there sure are a lot of mentions of it before that. And if it were really just a couple of houses and a farm, would it be shown on maps? Consider this 1773 map. Who knew that Chicago existed as early as 1773? On the map above, it looks like a star fort. This is the official timeline of Chicago. I'm impressed to find a visit to Chicago as far back as 1673, a whopping 147 years before Chicago was a farm and a few houses. If it was almost nothing in 1820, what might it have been in 1673? Less than nothing? Apparently it was defined as a site that could be visited. All I learned online about the first visitor, Jacques Marquette, and his visit is this. In October 1674, he left Green Bay to found a mission among the Illinois, whom he and Joliet were the first Europeans to have visited. In December, his health obliged him to stop at Chicago, from which he set out again on March 30, 1675. It seems mysterious to me. Stop at Chicago? What was Chicago? Marquette was a Jesuit, we learn. It is said that in 1696, the Jesuits established a mission in Chicago. Then, nothing is known about the mission or Chicago for 100 years until 1784, when Jean-Baptiste Point du Sable arrives in Chicago. Du Sable, it is taught, is the founder of Chicago. I quote, Du Sable is first recorded as living at the mouth of the Chicago River in a trader's journal of early 1790. By then, he had established an extensive and prosperous trading settlement in what later became the city of Chicago. He sold his Chicago River property in 1800 and moved to the port of St. Charles, where he was licensed to run a ferry across the Missouri River, end quote. The text says he had established an extensive and prosperous trading settlement. Is that to say that in 1820 and 1830, pictures depicting Chicago as nothing but a farm and empty land are fiction? This is supposed to have been Chicago when Baptiste founded it. Basically, one house and a collection of tents. So I guess when the Jesuits found it in the 1600s, it was empty, and when Du Sable found it in the 1700s, it was empty. And in 1830, it was mostly empty. Nothing to see, and yet throughout hundreds of years, people kept referring to this emptiness as Chicago, a place to visit, to go, to stay, and to trade. History books tell of a war in Chicago called the 1812 Fort Dearborn Massacre. I find it interesting that Fort Dearborn is referred to as a neighborhood from which civilians were enlisted. Where there's a neighborhood, there must be a city, or at the very least a village. The text is more in line with the neighborhood map by James Thompson that we saw above. And here's a map from 1570 by Abraham Ortelius. It was made long before the Jesuits arrived. The map you see above is either somewhat inaccurate or the geography was different in those days, which is what I believe.
But where Chicago is today, we see a place called Shilaga. The ancient name of Chicago is Shilaga. It was on the map before its history began. What is Shilaga? Is it a Native American settlement? What do historians say about it? I searched around and found that they say nothing. This is the only reference to it I found from the Chicago Tribune, which speaks about another map from Venice, but doesn't even bother to show that map. Venetians were the dominant world traders of the time. The article dismisses Shilaga as a mythical place because everything that doesn't fit fake history is called mythical. Does anyone seriously believe that people who were dead serious about their trade, as the Venetians were, would put fantasy places on their travel maps? The Old Water Tower. I browsed around Chicago until I found a random old building, the Water Tower. Across from the Water Tower, we find a structure with another tower-like chimney that belongs to the overall Old Chicago Waterworks. If the history of Chicago is fabricated, we must find evidence for that not only by looking at the whole, but also the particular. This is a drawing of the waterworks said to be from 1886. And this is said to be a photograph from before the fire, the Great Chicago Fire that destroyed much of the city, but not these structures, was in 1871. A close-up. And here's a quote from the Smithsonian Institute. The Chicago Water Tower is a contributing property and a landmark in the Old Chicago Water Tower District in Chicago, Illinois, United States, that is listed on the National Register of Historic Places. Built to enclose the tall machinery of a powerful water pump in 1869, it became particularly well known when it survived the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, although the area around it was burnt to the ground. End quote. So it was built in 1869, yes? In the preferred style of the farmers settling the area, yes? Too bad, then, that there's no mention of it in the Library of Congress newspaper archives of 1869. So it was built in 1869, yes? In the preferred style of the farmers settling in the area, yes? Too bad, then, that there's no mention of it in the Library of Congress newspaper archives of 1869. I spent some time browsing Chicago newspapers, particularly Chicago Tribune for 1869. Many things are mentioned in 1869, but not the completion of such a prominent building. You can try it for yourself. You won't find anything. How did I know this would be fake history before looking at it? It's because the architectural style is unlike Americans of the 1800s. The architecture appears to belong to some other forgotten civilization, one that may have been active worldwide. If the tower were built in 1869, the newspapers would have mentioned it. Instead, I found mention of it in a newspaper clipping from August 6, 1866, from the Chicago Tribune. proposals for a wrought iron standing pipe, Chicago Water Works. The article says that they want to fit piping into the Chicago Water Tower. This is in 1866. Why do the historians of Chicago and the Smithsonian tell us that the tower was built in 1869, 3 years later? The article says into the new tower of the waterworks, as if the waterworks already existed and a new tower was added. Or perhaps the building was already standing, then repurposed as waterworks. I may have found the tower in the 1853 drawing of the city, but before we look at the drawing, let's determine its exact location on a modern map. There it is, City Gallery in the historic water tower. On this image from 1853, if you go to where the water takes a curve and draw a line all the way to the right, you come upon this so-called water tower. As you can see, it's at the same location as our water tower, but the second chimney is missing. Is that the tower that was added in 1866? In the drawing, it looks more like a cathedral. To determine whether this is the water tower, standing as early as 1853, I looked for cathedrals of Chicago. I did find a cathedral nearby. It's in a similar architecture as the water towers. But on the map, this cathedral is too far to the west to be the same structure as in the old painting. It could be, but it's inconclusive. Even though the tower in the drawing looks more like a cathedral than a water tower, the cathedral above, called Holy Name Cathedral, as well as other cathedrals in the area, are not at the right spot. Or maybe the drawing is simply inaccurate. In any case, newspapers from 1869 make no mention of building this grand structure. Successfully faking history isn't easy. You need to pay attention to detail. I'll complete this section with a photo I dug up on Reddit marked Water Tower in 1868. That is 1 year before it was supposedly built. Here it is as seen from Pine Street. Ancient Rome in America. As I kept researching, I found more and more giveaways. This article is about how Chicago lifted itself out of the swamp and became a modern metropolis. Interesting wording there. In 1857, fully developed buildings were being lifted out of the swamp, the article informs us. Had the old Chicago been flooded? Were these the structures of a lost civilization? Was Chicago really dug out rather than built? This historical period is called the Raising of Chicago. Wikipedia informs us, quote, during the 1850s and 1860s, engineers carried out a piecemeal raising of the level of central Chicago. Streets, sidewalks, and buildings were physically raised on jack screws. The work was funded by private property owners and public funds. End quote. Wow. I thought that in 1850, Chicago was just newly built, and they already have to raise it out of the mud? Quote, many of central Chicago's hurriedly erected wooden frame buildings were now considered inappropriate to the burgeoning and increasingly wealthy city. Rather than raise them several feet, proprietors often preferred to relocate these old frame buildings, replacing them with new masonry blocks built to the latest grade. Consequently, the practice of putting the old multi-story intact and furnished wooden buildings, sometimes entire rows of them, en bloc on rollers, and moving them to the outskirts of town or to the suburbs was so common as to be considered nothing more than routine traffic. Traveler David McRae wrote, never a day passed during my stay in the city that I did not meet one or more houses shifting their quarters. One day I met 9. Going out Great Madison Street in the horse cars, we had to stop twice to let houses get across. The function for which such a building had been constructed would often be maintained during the move. A family could begin dining at one address and end their meal at another, and a shop owner could keep their shop open even as customers had to climb in through a moving front door. Brick buildings were also moved from one location to another, and in 1866, the first of these, a brick building of 2.5 stories, made the short move from Madison Street out to Monroe Street. Later, many other much larger brick buildings were rolled much greater distances across Chicago. End quote. Say what? People rolled and carried large brick buildings across Chicago? I learn something new every day. If true, that's amazing. Unfortunately, I could find no photography of any of this taking place. It's even more amazing that something that great wouldn't just once be documented in a photo. I found no photographic evidence of the building of this massive city in the 1840s or the gargantuan task of moving it in the 1850s. Photography was around since 1820. Surely Chicago was photographed before 1853. We have many photos of the U.S. prior to 1850. One of the trademark Chicago places is the Wrigley Building, said to have been built in 1920. It still stands today. This photo is from 1929. It is said to have been built by the architect team Graham, Anderson, Probst, and White. This team created almost every significant building in Chicago. They also created the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., the Capitol Building in Washington, D.C., the State Bank of Chicago, the Strauss Building in Chicago, the Municipal Court Building in Chicago, local Federal Reserve Bank buildings, a government explosives plant in West Virginia, the Washington, D.C. Post Office, the Suburban Station in Philadelphia, Shedd Aquarium, Chicago, Field Museum, Chicago, Terminal Tower, Cleveland, Motorola World Headquarters, Civic Opera House, Chicago, several structures of the University of Notre Dame, and many others. The predecessors of this amazing architectural team was Graham, Burnham, and Co., and before that, Burnham and Root, who built just as many buildings. They were also the primary contributors to the massive Columbian Exposition that made Chicago look like ancient Rome. The world expositions of the 19th century were mysteriously erected in a very fast pace and just as quickly disassembled or burned to the ground. There's a whole book that was written just to examine the fact that not all is as it seems with the expositions of the 1800s. Most books on fake history are poorly written, but this book is excellent. When I read it in 2020, I finished it in only 2 sittings. Long story short, combining the book above with what I've uncovered while writing this article, I no longer believe that this architectural team around Ernest Robert Graham built almost every structure of significance across the United States. There is the possibility that these grand structures were not built, but rather undug out of the muddy swamp. These could have been the remains of that ancient and legendary Shalaga that the Venetians knew, or perhaps even built. History fabricators simply ascribed all these buildings to the same couple of architects. The problem is that I find almost no designs, construction plans, or construction photos of any of these buildings. How is that even possible? I type Graham Anderson Probst White construction photo into a search engine and get back almost nothing, with very few exceptions. And I find almost nothing on what should be the most famous architects of all time. My search term Howard White, architect, brings up exactly nothing. Imagine building the grandest buildings the world has ever seen, but there's no mention of you on Google. Graham, who has even more buildings to his name through his previous work with Burnham, is only worth 3 portrait images overall. If he had really built all those fantastical structures, don't you think there might be thousands of pictures of this man? Would he not be one of the most celebrated individuals in the history of the country? Superstar designer Pierce Anderson is only worth 2 pictures. Edward Probst, builder of hundreds of grand buildings, only has 2 photos, one of them an obituary. Many famous buildings they were supposed to have built aren't even mentioned on their Wikipedia page. For example, the iconic Flatiron Building in New York. The old newspaper article says it was designed by Graham, but Wikipedia says it was built by Burnham. These names are used interchangeably. It appears that the most famous architect in recent history chose as their office a wooden shack. While building the Field Museum you see in this image on the left. This is the Merchandise Mart, Chicago, also made by Graham and Friends. I'd be hard-pressed to find buildings built this large today. The massive Masonic Temple of Chicago, built by Burnham or Graham, depending on which source you consult.
But I mustn't conceal that I did find construction photos of the more recent Merchandise Mart in Chicago. In fact, I found construction photos of every phase of its building. One example here. So yes, this building really was constructed when they say it was, it appears. Perhaps there's more pictorial evidence of it because it's more recent. Maybe photos of the 1800s are simply lost. I ran this and other photos through online photo manipulation checks called image edited and photo forensics. The photos seem to be genuine, and that's wonderful. It means not all things are fake, and we are capable of building the big stuff. I also found construction photos of the Flatiron Building in New York. But where are the photos of the also fairly recent Wrigley's Building construction? Where are the designs? The building was started in 1920 and completed in 1924. I found one single photo of its construction in 1923, half finished. The problem? There are plenty of photos of the building being whole and complete in 1922 and 1921. Here's just a few examples. These photos are all marked 1921 on historical websites. You can see the completed Wrigley Building, background right side. This one is marked as a 1921 airplane view. There are no signs of construction. The building is complete. This is a 1921 article speaking of the newly completed Wrigley Building in 1921. And the image here is ascribed to 1922. I learned that the Wrigley Building was completed in 1924 and still under construction in 1923, based on a single vague construction photo. Then I learned it was already up and complete in 1921. I'm not going to go through all buildings built by the people around Graham, but with the exception of those already mentioned, I did not find a single structure where the process of design, construction, and completion is clear. This photo of Wrigley Building is marked 1922. In all honesty, does the building look like it's under construction? And does it look brand sparkling new? If you look closely, there are already shop signs, curtains, and signs of tear and wear on this quote-unquote newly constructed or quote-unquote yet to be constructed building. I'm not surprised that I found no full panorama or aerial view of Chicago River from any time before 1921. Not one. The reason for this could be that the Wrigley Building is much too prominent. If it was already standing before 1921, it could be seen on almost any full view of Chicago River, as well as other buildings that were supposedly built in the 1920s. If there are fabricators of history, they simply went and removed any and all aerial images of Chicago River pre-1921. And this must be one of the strangest photos of the Chicago Field Museum around. It's presented across history websites as nothing unusual, But if ancient structures were dug out of the ground, as I say, excavated, not built, this photo could serve as evidence. We see a grand structure surrounded by dirt, rocks, and mud. There are no streets, no pavement, no other houses. This isn't normally how things work. If you build like that, you normally first have corresponding infrastructure. I guess it's conceivable that they built in the middle of a wasteland, but it is weird. The photo is claimed to be from 1921, according to the website of the Field Museum. Here's an image of the Field Museum's quote-unquote construction. Notice anything? I do. It does not look under construction, it looks complete. The site as a whole looks more like digging work has been done than actual construction. Strangely enough, the Wikipedia entry says nothing about its construction or design. One of the finest designs in the history of America, and there's no mention on how it all happened. I found only 2 construction photos from 1918. This is one of them. And the other. As in many other cases, these look more like the renovation of a Roman temple than a construction of an American museum. I did find one single photograph that shows genuine construction work, said to be of the Field Museum in 1915. But it's fake. I ran it through forensics, photo forensics, and it appears that the writing at the bottom is a modern Photoshop edition. Someone took a photo of some other construction and claimed that it's the Field Museum. But I wouldn't even have needed forensics. You can see with the naked eye that these columns and windows are too small to be of the Field Museum. They bear no resemblance. This is the directly adjacent Soldier Field Sports Stadium. I'm not going to go on about that now, nor about many other things. The original version of this article was 3 times as long. It could have easily become a book just on Chicago. That's because there's no end to this rabbit hole. What you were taught in school is not reliable. Everything is up for discussion. Now, I don't expect history to be entirely accurate. It will always be written with bias and omission, but what we see here goes beyond bias or error into outright fabrication. In school, I never learned there was a Shilaga in the 1500s that turned into Chicago in the 1600s. I clearly remember learning that Chicago didn't exist before 1840. These are not the results of innocent mistakes, but deliberate deception. I don't wish to spoon-feed everything to you, so I'll leave this beautiful building to your own research.